The bedroom door swung open at 2:47 a.m., and Margaret Reynolds knew immediately that something was wrong. Not because of the sound. Her husband David had always been quiet, methodical in his movements. But because of the silence that followed. The kind of silence that screams. She lay in the hospital-grade bed they'd installed in their master bedroom, her 46-year-old body still healing from the emergency C-section 3 weeks prior. Baby Emma slept in the bassinet beside her, wrapped in the pink blanket Margaret's mother had crocheted before her death. The nightlight cast shadows across David's face as he stood in the doorway, and for the first time in 22 years of marriage, Margaret didn't recognize the man looking back at her. His eyes were empty. Not sad. Not angry. Just absent. David? Her voice cracked. What's wrong? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the bassinet, stared down at their daughter. Their miracle baby, and whispered words that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. This isn't what I signed up for. Margaret Ann Reynolds, née Patterson, ***, was born on September 14, 1978, in Portland, Oregon, to schoolteacher parents who believed in sacrifice, duty, and the quiet dignity of endurance. She'd learned early that love meant putting others first, that happiness was something you earned through service, not something you demanded. At 46, her auburn hair had started showing silver at the temples, something she'd stopped dyeing after the pregnancy. Her hands, once smooth and pianist graceful, now bore the age spots and wrinkles of middle age. But her eyes, green and sharp, still held the determination of the girl who'd put herself through nursing school while working 3 jobs. David Michael Reynolds *** was born on March 3, 1976, in Seattle, Washington, into old money and older expectations. His father had been a federal judge, his mother, a prominent attorney. David had inherited their precision, their need for control, their belief that life could be managed like a courtroom, orderly, predictable, subject to rules and precedents. At 48, he was still handsome in that patrician way, tall, graying at the temples, with the kind of jawline that photographs well. He ran a successful estate planning firm in downtown Portland, helping wealthy families protect their legacies. Control was his business. Control was his life. They'd met in 2002 at a hospital fundraiser. Margaret had been working the ER, David had been there representing his father's foundation. He'd been drawn to her quiet competence, the way she moved through chaos with grace. She'd been drawn to his stability, the promise of a life less uncertain than the one she'd known growing up. Their wedding in 2003 had been small, elegant, controlled, everything David wanted. Margaret hadn't minded. She'd never been one for spectacle. For 22 years, their marriage had worked on a simple equation: David provided structure, Margaret provided warmth. He handled finances, planning, the architecture of their life. She handled emotions, connection, the invisible labor that held everything together. They'd tried for children early. Month after month of negative pregnancy tests. 3 rounds of IVF that ended in heartbreak. 2 miscarriages that nearly broke Margaret. By 2015, they'd stopped trying. David had seemed relieved. Margaret had mourned in silence. They'd settled into a different kind of marriage, companionable, comfortable, childless. David traveled for work. Margaret took on extra shifts at the hospital. They had dinner parties. They went to the symphony. They looked, from the outside, like the kind of couple who had it all figured out. But Margaret had felt the absence like a phantom limb. Every baby she delivered in the maternity ward was a reminder of what she'd lost. Every pregnant woman she cared for was a mirror to her own emptiness. Then, in January 2025, 2 months before her 46th birthday, the impossible happened. Margaret had chalked up the missed periods to early menopause. The fatigue to her grueling schedule. The nausea to stress. It wasn't until she fainted during a shift that her colleague insisted on running tests. Pregnant. 6 weeks. A 1 in a million chance at her age, with her history. When she told David, his face had gone pale. Not with joy, with something else. Something she couldn't quite name but felt in her gut like ice water. "Are you sure?" he'd asked. "Yes. And you want to keep it?" The question had stunned her. "Of course. David, this is our miracle." He'd been silent for a long time. Then, mechanical as always, "We'll need to find a high-risk OB, update our insurance. Convert the guest room to a nursery." No excitement. No tears of joy. Just logistics. Margaret had told herself it was a shock. That he'd come around. That once he held their baby, everything would change. She'd been right about one thing, everything did change. Just not the way she'd imagined. The Reynolds home sat in Portland's West Hills, a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors and a view of Mount Hood. It was the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines, tasteful, curated, expensive. David had bought it in 2008, right after his father died, using his inheritance to secure exactly the life he wanted. Every room told a story of control. The living room with its cream-colored furniture that no child could safely occupy. The kitchen with its marble countertops that showed every smudge. The study where David spent his evenings, door closed, organizing other people's futures while his own remained carefully contained. Margaret had decorated sparingly over the years, adding warmth where she could, throw pillows in jewel tones, plants on the windowsills, photographs from their travels. But the house had always felt more like David's than theirs. She'd learned not to mind. It was enough to have a home at all. Her own childhood had been different. Her parents' modest bungalow in southeast Portland had been cramped, cluttered, full of second-hand furniture and love. Her father had taught middle school English. Her mother, elementary math. Money had always been tight, but their home had been warm, loud, alive with music and laughter and the chaos of Margaret and her two siblings. When Margaret was 15, her older brother, James, had died in a car accident. Drunk driver. Wrong place, wrong time. The grief had hollowed out her family. Her father had started drinking. Her mother had disappeared into silence. Margaret had become the caretaker. Making dinners, doing laundry, holding everyone together while she fell apart inside. She'd learned early, your pain doesn't matter as much as other people's needs. David's childhood had been the opposite, privileged, structured, emotionally barren. His parents had been brilliant, accomplished, and utterly unavailable. His father had worked 16-hour days. His mother had channeled her ambition into pro bono cases and charitable boards. David and his younger sister, Catherine, had been raised primarily by nannies and boarding schools. He'd learned early, emotions are weaknesses to be managed, not expressed. When they'd married, their wounds had seemed compatible. Margaret's need to nurture had met David's need to be cared for. His need for order had met her desire for stability. They'd built a life that worked, even if it didn't quite sing. But the pregnancy had exposed the fault lines. David had grown increasingly distant throughout Margaret's second and third trimesters. He'd buried himself in work, taking on new clients, traveling more frequently. When he was home, he was physically present but emotionally absent, going through motions, checking boxes, but never truly engaging. Margaret had tried to pull him in. She'd bought books on late-in-life parenting, set them on his nightstand. She'd shown him ultrasound photos, pointed out tiny fingers and toes. She'd talked about names, nursery colors, the future they'd build together. He'd responded with monosyllables and tight smiles. The baby shower had been particularly painful. Margaret's nursing colleagues had thrown her a party at the hospital, pink balloons, ridiculous games, an outpouring of joy for their beloved charge nurse. David had shown up late, stayed 40 minutes, and left early for a client emergency. One of Margaret's friends, Patricia, had pulled her aside afterward. "Is he okay? He seems off." "He's just stressed with work," Margaret had said automatically. This baby was unexpected. He needs time to adjust. But late at night, when Emma kicked against her ribs and Margaret lay awake in the dark, she'd wondered, what if he never adjusts? What if he resents this child? What if he resents me? The birth had been traumatic. Margaret's blood pressure had spiked at 37 weeks, severe preeclampsia. The emergency C-section had saved both their lives, but the recovery had been brutal. At 46, her body didn't bounce back the way younger mothers did. The incision hurt. Breastfeeding was agony. Sleep deprivation felt like torture. And through it all, David had become a ghost. He'd taken his 2 weeks of paternity leave, but he'd spent them in his study, door closed, fielding urgent calls. He'd held Emma exactly twice, both times when visitors were present. He'd never changed a diaper. Never walked the floors with her at 3 a.m. Never looked at his daughter with anything resembling love. Margaret had told herself he was overwhelmed, adjusting, protecting himself from the vulnerability of new parenthood. She'd made excuses, covered for him, shouldered everything alone. Until that night. Until he'd stood over their daughter's bassinet and said those words. "This isn't what I signed up for." The morning after David's strange midnight appearance, Margaret found him in the kitchen, dressed for work, drinking coffee like nothing had happened. "David, we need to talk about last night." "I don't know what you mean." His voice was flat, detached. "You came into the bedroom at almost 3 a.m. You said. I must have been sleepwalking. Stress. The new baby." He set down his mug with careful precision. "I have a meeting at 8. We'll talk tonight." They didn't talk that night. Or the next. Or the one after that. Instead, David became a master of evasion. He left earlier each morning, came home later each evening. When he was home, he moved through the house like a stranger touring a museum, observing, never touching, maintaining careful distance from both Margaret and Emma. Margaret started noticing small things. Wrong things. His phone, which he'd always left casually on the counter, now went everywhere with him, bathroom, bedroom, even to get the mail. He'd changed his passcode. When she asked why, he'd said something about work security protocols. He'd started showering immediately when he came home, even though he worked at a desk. New cologne appeared in their bathroom, something expensive, heavy, nothing like what he usually wore. Late-night phone calls became frequent. He'd step outside to take them, pacing the backyard in the dark, voice low and urgent. When Margaret asked who was calling, he'd say, "Clients," or "the office," or "Catherine." His sister, who Margaret knew for a fact never called that late. The credit card statements showed charges Margaret didn't recognize. Restaurants they'd never been to. A jewelry store where David had never shopped for her. Hotels in downtown Portland, even though they lived 20 minutes away. When she questioned him, he'd become defensive. "Are you seriously monitoring my credit cards?" "I'm working, Margaret. Entertaining clients. Building a business that supports this family." This family? She'd been holding Emma, rocking her gently. "When was the last time you even looked at your daughter?" "Don't start." "Start what?" "Asking you to be present." "Asking you to." "I'm doing my best." The sudden volume made Emma startle and cry. David had looked at the baby with something close to disgust. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't sign up to start over at 48 with a newborn and sleepless nights in." He'd stopped himself, grabbed his jacket, and left. That was when Margaret started keeping a journal. She documented everything. He came home. Phone calls he took in secret. Unexplained absences. The way he flinched when Emma cried. The way he looked at Margaret sometimes, not with anger or frustration, but with something colder. Calculation. Her nursing instincts, honed over 2 decades of reading patients' bodies for signs of hidden illness, started screaming warnings. She called Catherine, David's sister, under the pretense of asking parenting advice. "Has David seemed okay to you?" Catherine, always direct, didn't hesitate. "He seems miserable. I told him he should go to therapy. The baby thing is clearly triggering something." "What thing?" A pause. "He never told you." "Told me what?" "When we were kids, our mother had a late-in-life pregnancy. I was 12, David was 14. It was not good. The baby had severe disabilities. My parents couldn't cope. It destroyed their marriage. They institutionalized the baby, pretended he didn't exist. David's never forgiven them for it. Or himself for not fighting harder for our brother." Margaret's blood ran cold. "He has another sibling." "Had. Matthew died in the institution when he was 7. David's carried that guilt his whole life." After hanging up, Margaret sat in the nursery, holding Emma, her mind racing. She understood trauma. She understood how the past could poison the present. But understanding didn't change the fact that her husband was disappearing, and she was alone with a newborn who deserved better than a father who couldn't even look at her. That night, she heard him come home at midnight. Heard him pause outside the nursery door, not entering, just standing there. She pretended to be asleep, watching through barely open eyes as he finally walked away. The next morning, she found rose petals in his car. Red roses. The expensive kind. She'd never gotten roses from David. Not even on their wedding day. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just looked at her with those empty eyes and said, "I think we need to talk about the future." The conversation didn't happen that day. Or the next. David kept postponing, work crises, exhaustion, not the right time. Margaret's anxiety crystallized into something harder, determination. She'd spent too much of her life accommodating other people's needs. Not anymore. Not when her daughter's well-being was at stake. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after finding the rose petals, Margaret did something she'd never done in 22 years of marriage. She hired a private investigator. His name was Robert Chen, a former Portland police detective who now ran a small firm specializing in domestic cases. Margaret had found him through Patricia, her nursing colleague whose divorce 2 years earlier had involved similar suspicions. "I just need to know the truth," Margaret told him, sitting in his modest office in northeast Portland, Emma asleep in her carrier. "If he's having an affair, I need evidence. For the divorce. For custody." Robert, 60-something with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had nodded. "I'll need 3 days. Maybe a week. Can you afford to wait?" She could. Barely. 5 days later, Robert called her. "We need to meet." Not over the phone. They met at a coffee shop far from the hospital, far from David's office. Robert slid a manila envelope across the table. "I'm sorry, Margaret." Inside were photographs. David entering a downtown hotel with a woman Margaret had never seen, blonde, 30-something, beautiful in a sharp, professional way. David and the woman at restaurants, laughing over wine. David and the woman in his parked car, kissing. But it was the last set of photographs that made Margaret's world implode. David and the woman exiting a medical office. The sign visible, Portland Reproductive Health Center. Robert's voice was gentle. "I pulled some records, carefully, legally. The woman's name is Vanessa Morton. She's 32, works as a paralegal at a competing estate planning firm. They've been seeing each other for approximately 8 months. 8 months. Margaret had been 6 months pregnant 8 months ago." The medical office? Her voice sounded distant, not her own. "I can't confirm without violating privacy laws, but..." Robert hesitated. That clinic specializes in fertility treatments and prenatal care. They went there together 3 times in the last month. The implication hung in the air, terrible and clear. While Margaret had been struggling through a high-risk pregnancy at 46, David had been planning a different future. With someone younger. Someone who could give him the kind of parenthood he actually wanted, planned, controlled, without the complications of a geriatric pregnancy and a wife he'd grown to resent. Margaret sat in that coffee shop, holding the photographs, feeling something inside her crack and reshape into something new. Not grief. Not a shock. Something colder and sharper. Thank you, Robert. What are you going to do? Good question. That night, Margaret waited until David came home. 11:47 p.m. She sat in the living room, lights off, photographs spread on the coffee table. When he walked in, she turned on the lamp. He froze. Sit down, David. To his credit, he didn't deny it. He looked at the photographs, looked at Margaret, and sat. How long have you known? He asked. Does it matter? Margaret. Is she pregnant? Silence. Then, yes. The word landed like a physical blow. Margaret had prepared herself, but hearing it confirmed was different. Worse. How far along? 12 weeks. 12 weeks. While Margaret had been in the hardest phase of newborn care, sleep-deprived and healing from surgery, David had been celebrating a new pregnancy. A do-over. A chance to erase his mistakes. Were you ever going to tell me? David's face was unreadable. I was waiting for the right time. The right time. Margaret laughed, sharp and bitter. When? When Emma graduates high school. When I'm dead. Don't be dramatic. Dramatic? She stood, trembling with rage. You've been lying to me for months. You've abandoned your newborn daughter. You've been building a new life while I've been drowning trying to hold ours together. And you're calling me dramatic? I didn't plan this. For the first time, David's control cracked. I didn't want this baby, Margaret. I told you, I was done with the idea of children. You knew my history. You knew what happened with Matthew. But you wanted this anyway, and I tried, God knows I tried, but every time I look at Emma, all I see is... He stopped himself. Say it, Margaret commanded. All you see is what? Failure. Obligation. 48 years old and starting over with diapers and sleepless nights when I should be thinking about retirement. And yes, when I met Vanessa, when I realized I could have something different, something I actually chose. Get out. Margaret. Get out. Emma started crying in the nursery upstairs. Margaret's voice dropped to something lethal. Get your things and get out of this house. Tonight. This is my house. Then I'll leave. Emma and I will be gone by morning. And then you'll hear from my lawyer. David stood, straightened his jacket, always in control, even now. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We can settle this civilly. I'll provide financially for Emma. You'll keep the house. We'll work out custody. Custody? Margaret's laugh was hollow. You haven't held your daughter in 3 weeks. You don't get to talk about custody. Something flickered in David's eyes then. Something Margaret had never seen before. Not anger. Not guilt. Fret. Be careful, Margaret. You're not thinking clearly. Postpartum hormones, sleep deprivation, judges take that into account. If you push this the wrong way, if you try to keep Emma from me, there are things I can do. Medical records I can subpoena. Witnesses who can testify to your instability. Margaret went very still. Are you threatening me? I'm protecting my interests. And Vanessa's. And our babies. He moved toward the door, then paused. You can be reasonable about this, or you can make it ugly. Your choice. He left. Margaret stood in the darkened living room, listening to Emma cry upstairs, and felt something inside her crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. She'd been a caretaker her whole life. Accommodating. Selfless. Kind. That woman died tonight. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She fed Emma, rocked her, sang her the lullabies her own mother had sung, and planned. By dawn, she'd made 3 decisions. First, she would not leave this house. Second, she would fight for full custody with every resource at her disposal. Third, she would find out exactly who David Reynolds really was, because the man she'd married wouldn't have threatened her. Which meant she'd never really known him at all. She called Robert Chen at 7 a.m. I need you to dig deeper. Everything. Financial records, past relationships, business dealings. If there's anything he's hiding, I need to know. That kind of investigation costs. I don't care. Bill me whatever it takes. Next, she called her own attorney, Amanda Brooks, a family law specialist Patricia had recommended. Amanda was a tiger in court, known for destroying men who tried to weaponize their resources against their ex-wives. He threatened you. Amanda's voice was ice. Document everything. Every conversation, text, email. Oregon is a no-fault divorce state, but his affair and abandonment of Emma will matter for custody. And his threat to claim postpartum instability? That's going to backfire spectacularly when we're done with him. Then Margaret did something harder. She called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. She couldn't afford to be distracted. Emma needed her. This fight needed her. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret transformed into someone she barely recognized. She documented everything, photographed the pristine nursery David had never entered, saved voicemails he'd ignored, created spreadsheets of his absences. She installed security cameras throughout the house with Amanda's guidance. She opened a separate bank account and moved half their savings into it. And she waited for Robert's investigation. The report arrived on Thursday. Margaret read it in Emma's nursery while her daughter napped, and with each page, her understanding of her marriage, of her entire adult life, disintegrated. David's affair with Vanessa wasn't his first. Robert had found evidence of at least 3 previous affairs over their marriage. A colleague from his firm in 2010. A client in 2015. A woman he'd met at a conference in 2019. All brief. All meticulously hidden. All ending when David got bored or the woman demanded more. But it was worse. David's estate planning business had been investigated twice for ethical violations, cases where he'd allegedly manipulated elderly clients into changing their wills to benefit people David represented, earning himself substantial fees. Nothing had been proven, but the complaints were there, buried in state bar records. And then there was the money. Over the past year, David had moved significant funds out of their joint accounts into offshore holdings Margaret had never known about. Almost $400,000, money that should have been marital property. Money he'd hidden, likely planning for this divorce long before Margaret had even suspected the affair. Robert's report included one more detail that made Margaret's stomach turn. Vanessa Morton wasn't just David's girlfriend. She was the daughter of one of his wealthiest clients, a real estate mogul dying of cancer. David had drafted the man's will. Had likely manipulated it to benefit Vanessa. Was possibly planning to marry her and access her inheritance. Margaret called Amanda immediately. He's been planning this for over a year. Maybe longer. This wasn't about me getting pregnant, that just accelerated his timeline. Then we accelerate ours, Amanda said. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow and requesting an emergency custody hearing. His financial fraud, his abandonment of Emma, his affair with a client's daughter, were going to bury him. But Margaret had underestimated David. That evening, she received a certified letter. David was countersuing for divorce and requesting primary custody of Emma, claiming Margaret was suffering from severe postpartum depression and was a danger to herself and the baby. He'd attached affidavits from 3 people, his sister Catherine, whose statement had clearly been coerced, his office manager, and a neighbor Margaret barely knew, all stating they'd observed concerning behavior. The letter also informed her that David had filed for a restraining order, claiming Margaret had threatened him. It was all lies. Calculated, strategic lies. But it was brilliantly done. David knew the legal system. He'd spent his career manipulating it. Margaret sat in the nursery, holding the letter, understanding finally what she was up against. This wasn't just a divorce. This was war. And David was willing to destroy her to win. She looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to fight David in court. She was going to expose him completely. Margaret had never considered herself a strategist. She'd always been reactive, accommodating, the person who smoothed things over and made peace. But motherhood, specifically, the primal need to protect her daughter, had unlocked something dormant inside her. Not rage. Rage was hot and uncontrolled. This was colder. Clearer. The kind of focused determination she'd seen in trauma surgeons making life-or-death decisions in seconds. She started with Stoic philosophy, something her father had studied before his death. She'd found his old books in storage, pulled them out, and read late into the night while Emma slept. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Marcus Aurelius. She couldn't control David's lies. But she could control her response. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. David's legal threats weren't obstacles. They were opportunities to reveal his character. She began sleeping again, not much, but enough. She ate deliberately, stayed hydrated, took care of her body the way she'd taken care of patients for 20 years. She needed to be sharp. Present. Unbreakable. She stopped crying. Stopped arguing with David during their stilted phone exchanges about logistics. She became polite, neutral, maddeningly calm. It unsettled him. She could hear it in his voice. You're being unreasonable about the custody arrangement, he'd say. I disagree, but I'm willing to discuss it with our attorneys present. Margaret, don't make this ugly. I'm not making anything ugly, David. I'm protecting my daughter. Her transformation wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. She reached out to every person mentioned in Robert's report. The women David had affairs with. The clients who'd filed ethics complaints. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for patterns. For evidence. For the truth about who David Reynolds really was beneath his carefully constructed facade. One woman, Rachel, the 2015 affair, agreed to meet her. They sat in a quiet restaurant, 2 women whose lives had been shaped by the same man's lies. He told me his marriage was over, Rachel said. That you 2 were just going through the motions. That he was planning to leave but needed to wait for the right time. She laughed bitterly. I was so stupid. I actually believed him. How did it end? I got pregnant. I was 36, thrilled. Thought we'd finally be together. Rachel's eyes were distant, haunted. He gave me $20,000 and the name of a clinic. Told me he couldn't have children, that it would ruin everything. When I refused, he made it very clear I'd regret keeping it. I miscarried 2 weeks later. Never knew if it was stress or something else. Margaret felt sick. Did he? I don't know. I'll never know. But the way he looked at me when I told him about the pregnancy. I saw something in his eyes that scared me. So I walked away. That conversation confirmed what Margaret had started to suspect. David wasn't just a cheater. He was a narcissist with a pathological need for control. And when things didn't go according to his plan, he eliminated them. Or tried to. Margaret's attorney, Amanda, used the information brilliantly. In the custody hearing, she presented a pattern: David's serial affairs, his manipulation of clients, his financial fraud, his abandonment of Emma, and most damning, Rachel's testimony about his response to her pregnancy. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, listened carefully. David's attorney argued postpartum depression, instability, Margaret's obsessive documentation. Amanda countered with medical records showing Margaret's mental health was sound, with testimony from Margaret's colleagues about her exemplary nursing career, with the security camera footage showing David's utter disinterest in his daughter. But the turning point came when Amanda introduced the financial records showing David had been systematically hiding marital assets. "Your Honor," Amanda said, "Mr. Reynolds isn't seeking custody because he cares about his daughter. He's seeking custody because he wants to avoid paying child support and maintain control over his ex-wife. Every action he's taken, the affair, the financial fraud, the threats, follows the same pattern: when David Reynolds can't control something, he destroys it." The judge ruled in Margaret's favor. Temporary full custody to Margaret. Supervised visitation only for David. Financial assets frozen pending full disclosure. Margaret left the courthouse feeling something she hadn't felt in months: hope. But she'd learned enough about David to know, this wasn't over. Wounded narcissists were dangerous. And she'd just wounded him publicly, legally, completely. The weeks following the custody hearing were deceptively quiet. David had moved in with Vanessa. He'd been suspended from his law practice pending ethics investigations. His carefully constructed life was unraveling. Margaret knew better than to relax. She installed better security systems. Changed the locks. Informed Emma's pediatrician that only she was authorized to take the baby from the office. She varied her routes home from errands. She kept her phone charged, close. Patricia, her nursing colleague, had moved into the guest room temporarily. "You're not staying in this house alone," she'd insisted. "Not until this is settled." The supervised visitations with David were brief, tense affairs in a family court facility. David would sit in the visitation room, holding Emma awkwardly while a social worker watched. He'd make minimal effort, wouldn't sing to her, wouldn't play, would just hold her and stare at the clock. After the third visitation, the social worker pulled Margaret aside. "I've done this for 15 years. I've never seen a father so detached. It's like he's performing fatherhood, not feeling it. Will that affect custody? It'll be in my report." Meanwhile, Margaret had started divorce proceedings. Amanda was pushing for full asset disclosure, alimony, child support, and a settlement that would ensure Emma's future was secure. David's attorney was fighting everything. The mediation sessions were brutal. David would sit across from Margaret, his face a mask of contempt, and argue about every dollar, every detail. "You're not entitled to half," he'd say. "You haven't worked in months. I've been caring for our daughter. The daughter you abandoned. You chose to quit working. I took leave to recover from a traumatic birth. Your daughter's traumatic birth." Back and forth. Hours of it. Margaret would leave each session exhausted, furious, but also strangely energized. Each argument revealed more of David's true character. Each petty fight over money or belongings showed the mediator exactly who he was. Then, 6 weeks after the custody hearing, Margaret received a call from Robert Chen. "You need to hear this." His voice was grave. "I've been keeping tabs on David, like you asked. Last night, he had dinner with someone. Former client of his, Kenneth Morse." Margaret knew the name. Morse had been investigated for insurance fraud a decade ago. Had connections to organized crime. Had somehow avoided prosecution. Why would David meet with him? "I don't know. But their conversation. I couldn't hear specifics, but body language suggests David was asking for help with something. Or someone. Margaret's blood ran cold. You think he'd? I think a man who's lost his reputation, his practice, his marriage, and his control might do something desperate. I think you need to be very careful. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the house settle, to Emma's soft breathing over the baby monitor, to every creak and whisper. At 2 a.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. Hello. Breathing. Then, you should have taken the settlement. David's voice. Quiet. Controlled. Terrifying. David. You've destroyed everything, Margaret. My practice. My relationship with Vanessa, she left me, did you know that? Didn't want to be associated with a fraud. My reputation. My future. You did that yourself. No. You did. By being vindictive. By not accepting that our marriage was over. You cheated on me. You abandoned our daughter. You stole from our accounts. I gave you everything. The control cracked. 22 years. Financial security. A beautiful home. Respect. And you couldn't just let me go. You had to make me the villain. You made yourself the villain. Silence. Then, softer, more dangerous, I want you to know, whatever happens next, you brought this on yourself. The line went dead. Margaret sat in the dark, heart pounding, and made a decision. She called 911. I need to report a threatening phone call from my estranged husband. The police took the threat seriously. They'd seen the custody case, knew David's history. They increased patrol near Margaret's house, documented the call, and issued a formal warning to David. But Margaret knew it wouldn't be enough. She'd spent her entire nursing career reading people, predicting what they'd do before they did it. Pattern recognition was her gift. And every pattern with David pointed to the same conclusion: he wouldn't stop until he'd regained control. The confrontation came 3 nights later. Margaret had put Emma down at 8 p.m., Patricia was in the guest room reading, and Margaret was in the kitchen making tea when she heard the sound. Not the front door. The back. Someone picking the lock. Her training kicked in. She grabbed her phone, pressed the emergency call Patricia had programmed, direct line to 911 with their address preloaded. Someone's breaking in, she whispered. Police are on the way. Get to a safe room. But Margaret couldn't get upstairs to Emma without crossing the kitchen. And the back door was opening. David stepped inside. He looked terrible, unshaven, gaunt, eyes hollow with something that might have been grief or rage or madness. David. I just want to talk. His voice was soft. Reasonable. The voice he used with difficult clients. The police are coming. Then we don't have much time. He moved closer. Margaret gripped her phone, fighting to keep her voice steady. What do you want? I want you to understand something. He was close now, close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath, see the tremor in his hands. I loved you. Once. Before all this. Before you made me into a monster. I didn't make you anything. You took everything from me. The mask cracked. I had a plan. A good plan. Vanessa and I could have been happy. Could have had a family the right way, young, healthy, normal. But you had to get pregnant. You had to make everything about what you wanted. What I wanted. David, Emma is your daughter. She's a mistake. He slammed his hand against the counter. A 46-year-old woman having a baby? It's selfish. Irresponsible. I told you I didn't want this, but you didn't care. You never cared about what I needed. Margaret had backed toward the stairs now. Then leave. Walk away. You don't want Emma, fine. Sign over your rights. But don't stand in my kitchen at midnight pretending I'm the villain in your story. I can't sign over my rights. The lawyers said child support follows me regardless. So I'm trapped. Paying for a child I never wanted, with a woman I don't love anymore, in a life I can't escape. So what? You came here to what, punish me? Scare me? I came to make you an offer. His voice dropped, became almost gentle. Let me take Emma. Tonight. Just for a few hours. I'll bring her back. No one gets hurt. And in exchange, I'll drop the custody fight. You can have everything, the house, the money, full custody. I just need to say goodbye properly. Every instinct Margaret had screamed danger. No. Margaret. You're not taking my daughter anywhere. His face changed. The mask shattered completely. What emerged was pure rage. Then you've made your choice. He lunged. Margaret screamed, ran for the stairs. She heard Patricia's door burst open, and heard her friend shouting. Heard sirens in the distance, too far, too slow. David caught her at the base of the stairs, grabbed her arm, spun her around. His hand closed around her throat. You should have given her to me, he hissed. Should have made this easy. Margaret couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in her vision. She clawed at his hands, kicked, fought with everything she had. Then Patricia was there, swinging something. The heavy brass lamp from the hallway table. It connected with David's shoulder. He stumbled, released Margaret. She fell, gasping, crawling toward the stairs. Had to get to Emma. Had to protect. David grabbed her ankle, dragged her back. If I can't have a future, neither can you. His hands found her throat again. And then the world exploded with light and sound. Police. Hands up. Officers poured through the front door, weapons drawn. David released Margaret, stumbled backward, hands raised. Margaret collapsed on the stairs, sobbing, Patricia beside her, both of them shaking. He tried to kill her. Patricia screamed. He tried to. The officers had David on the ground, cuffing him, reading his rights. He didn't resist. Just stared at Margaret with those empty, terrible eyes. This isn't over, he said quietly. You know that, right? This will never be over. But it was. David Reynolds was charged with breaking and entering, assault, attempted murder, and violation of a restraining order. His attorney tried to argue temporary insanity, emotional distress, a mental breakdown triggered by the divorce. The prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Torres who'd built her career on domestic violence cases, destroyed that defense systematically. She presented the threatening phone call, the pattern of escalating behavior, the calculated nature of David choosing to break in when he knew Margaret would be home. This wasn't a breakdown, Torres told the jury. This was a man who couldn't accept that he'd lost control. So he decided to eliminate what he couldn't control. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Margaret testified for 4 hours, describing the marriage, the affair, the abandonment, the threats, and finally that terrible night. She looked at David throughout her testimony, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to pity. He'd destroyed himself. She just refused to let him destroy her too. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. Mr. Reynolds, the judge said, looking at him with undisguised contempt, you had every advantage in life. Wealth, education, opportunity. You could have been a good husband, a good father. Instead, you chose to be a predator. You targeted women, manipulated clients, and when your own daughter was born, you saw her as an inconvenience to be eliminated. This sentence reflects not just what you did, but who you are. David showed no emotion. Just stared straight ahead as they led him away. After the trial, Margaret sat in the courthouse hallway, Emma in her arms, and felt the weight of the last year finally lift. Patricia sat beside her. "It's over. It's over," Margaret repeated. But there was still one more piece. Vanessa Morton had reached out during the trial, wanting to talk. They met at a park, two women carrying children, Emma at 10 months, Vanessa's daughter at 3 months. "I'm sorry," Vanessa said. "For everything. I didn't know he was lying about you. About marriage. I thought." "You thought what he told you to think," Margaret said gently. "That's what he does." "Did." "Yes. Did." They sat in silence, watching their daughters, understanding that they were both victims and both survivors of the same man's pathology. "What will you tell her?" Margaret asked, nodding at Vanessa's baby. "When she's old enough to ask about her father?" "The truth. That he was sick. That she's not responsible for his choices." Vanessa looked at Margaret. "What will you tell Emma?" Margaret looked down at her daughter. Her miracle baby, the child who'd cost her everything and given her everything. "I'll tell her that she was loved from the moment I knew she existed. That I fought for her. That she was worth every second of pain." Emma gurgled, grabbed Margaret's finger, and smiled. Margaret Reynolds, she'd kept the name, reclaimed it, made it mean something different, sat in the nursery 1 year after David's sentencing. Emma was asleep in her crib, 17 months old now, walking and babbling and becoming a person with opinions and preferences and the most beautiful laugh Margaret had ever heard. The house was quiet. Patricia had moved back to her own place 6 months ago, once it was clear David wasn't getting early parole. Margaret had returned to work part-time at the hospital, her colleagues welcoming her back with relief and celebration. The divorce had been finalized. The house was hers. The settlement had been substantial, everything David had tried to hide had been recovered and split. Emma's future was secure. But more than that, Margaret had discovered something unexpected: she liked herself now. The accommodating woman who'd spent 46 years putting everyone else first had died that night on the stairs. What emerged was someone stronger, clearer, more herself than she'd ever been. She'd learned that protecting yourself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. That demanding respect wasn't aggressive, it was healthy. That motherhood at 46 was hard and exhausting and sometimes overwhelming, but also miraculous and redemptive and the best thing she'd ever done. She'd learned that you could love someone for 22 years and still not really know them. That the person you thought you married might have been a performance, not a person. But mostly, she'd learned that she was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined. That when everything was stripped away, security, partnership, certainty, she could stand alone and not just survive, but thrive. Marcus Aurelius had been right: the impediment to action advances action. David's betrayal hadn't destroyed her. It had revealed her. Some nights, she still thought about him. Wondered if he'd ever understand what he'd thrown away. Wondered if he felt remorse or just rage at being caught. Mostly, though, she didn't think about him at all. She thought about Emma's first words, first steps, first everything. Thought about her own future, maybe traveling, maybe dating eventually, maybe just enjoying the hard-won piece of a life she'd built on her own terms. She'd survived the worst thing she could imagine. Everything else was just details. As Emma stirred in her sleep, Margaret reached into the crib, gently touched her daughter's soft hair, and whispered the words that had become her mantra. "We're going to be okay. Better than okay. We're going to be extraordinary." And she meant it. Margaret's story raises questions we all need to consider. How well do we really know the people we love? What do we do when the person we trusted most becomes unrecognizable? And most importantly, when do we stop accommodating and start protecting ourselves? If you've experienced betrayal, manipulation, or abuse in a relationship, please know, you are not alone. You are not crazy. You deserve safety, respect, and truth. Margaret's strength wasn't in never being afraid, it was in acting despite her fear. In choosing her daughter over her comfort. In refusing to be smaller so someone else could feel bigger. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have seen the signs earlier? Would you have fought as hard? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own stories if you feel comfortable. Your experience might help someone else recognize their own situation. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but for education. For awareness. For the person who's living this right now and needs to know, escape is possible. Survival is possible. Thriving on the other side is possible. Thank you for listening to Margaret and Emma's story. May it remind us all that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is protect ourselves and the people who depend on us, no matter the cost. Stay safe. Stay strong. And never stop fighting for the life you deserve, ***.